This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell, and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I tried to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real expertise in the field. This week, drugs, crime and rehab. In tandem with the Special 5 News investigation, I've been talking to Dame Carol Black, who was commissioned by the government 2 years ago to examine Britain's drugs epidemic and come up with proposals for prevention, treatment and recovery. She'll be handing her recommendations to the government in April, but she's been talking to us about what she's found and what we must do about it. Carol Black, thank you very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? Let's just look at the problem, first of all, that you have been working on boldly. How bad is it in the UK?
Pretty bad, Andy. I mean, 2 years ago, I started, commissioned by the then Home Secretary, to do part one, which was looking at supply and demand, and then to move on to prevention, treatment and recovery. So when we did part one, I think the best way, the easiest way I can describe what we found is to call it a perfect storm. So what we found was that drugs were really flooding into the country. The two big worrying drugs, if you like, heroin and cocaine. The political situation in the countries where they were grown made it easy for them to be exported. The weather had been very kind, so there was an abundance of supply. So the markets really, in the UK and everywhere else, were flooded. And that meant that there was plenty of supply of those drugs, plus a lot of new drugs coming online that people had access to. Much easier to send drugs through the post and to order them online. So it was easier to order them. The cocaine was rather purer, so rather stronger.
Is it fair to say the problem had actually got worse? Because we're used to there being a drug problem, but from what you could say, it was getting worse?
I would say the supply was getting worse, and then it met 10 years of austerity, particularly marked in the poorer parts of our country. And therefore, it was a very vulnerable audience, if you like. All the protective factors that we had available, resources for local governments to do good things for young people, support for families, vulnerable children. Everything had taken a hit. The police had less money. So it was this perfect storm of oversupply meeting a really very vulnerable situation. And you know from the figures that drug deaths have gone up, people dying on the street, homeless with drug intoxication had gone up. Nearly 50% of homicides had a drug-related problem, and a third of individuals in our prisons, again, a drug-related problem. So the whole thing had been getting worse, in contrast to the fact that, 5 years earlier, it was a better picture.
So is that also because the money that was in the system to deal with it had been cut back? You talked about austerity. Was that part of the problem?
There was overall a 17% cut in the funding for treatment, and in the worst of our boroughs, a 40%. And for the support for treatment for children, a cut of 25% in funding.
And was that normally, would that have come through local authorities, local councils?
Yes, because if you remember with the Lansley reforms, around about, 2013, the responsibility for the treatment and recovery of drug dependency went to local authorities.
We're talking about really people who are, vulnerable already and who are going to be put into a worse situation.
Yes, but do remember that also the recreational side has increased considerably. So all kinds of drug taking, not just that which is both dangerous to the individual, but very dangerous to society. But recreational drugs, all the trends are in the wrong direction.
I think you mentioned earlier about the prison population and how many people end up in our prison system related to drugs. I mean, I presume when a case comes before a court, comes before a judge, does the system have much choice except to send them to prison?
Well, it used to exercise that choice much more than it's been doing recently. So, of course, there is the choice anyway for the police themselves to divert away from the criminal justice system into other treatment, recovery, things that, if you like, have a more public health flavour. And the choice of the courts for the judge to do that sort of diversion. But recently, they haven't been doing it because there's been such a diminution of high quality treatment and recovery that actually diverting into treatment wasn't necessarily going to give you good treatment and recovery. I mean, resources have been so cut back. There are treatment services in our country where most of that treatment is delivered by non-qualified individuals.
And presumably also when people come out of prison, they're coming out into a system where they have very little support again, so it's easy for them to fall back.
I mean, sadly, that's absolutely true. About only a third of people leaving prison with a drug-related problem get into treatment within 3 weeks. And that's a very vulnerable time, as you know. I mean, the usual thing is if you've got no home to go to and no resources and no family, then you're just probably going to go back to your old habit. And many women prisoners that I met in Part 1, told me that they would just go back to prostitution.
That's a pretty gloomy picture all round. In your couple of years working on this, have you found anything that you go, yes, that's something that's positive, maybe that's something we can latch onto?
Oh, I mean, yes, of course. You see certain local councils where you've just got fantastic individuals who, despite everything, are just determined to make it work. So there are exceptions in local councils. There's as far as prisons are concerned, there's of course the drug rehabilitation prison at a home house, which did give me hope because you could see what could be done in a prison determined to do it differently. But of course, that takes a lot of resources. I've seen different charities doing excellent work. And of course, there are beacons of hope around. There's just what was needed, and what I will recommend is a much more whole system approach to this problem. There's no one Department of State can really do this on its own.
We'll come back to that, but I just want you to maybe give me some more specific examples, some detail, a little bit of detail about what the good work is that some of these places are doing. Just, more, give us a sort of nitty-gritty of what's going on.
Well, I mean, for example, in Manchester, this is nearly 2 years ago when I was doing Part 1, I met a wonderful charity that really looked after women street workers who were drug dependent and who did, serve time in prison. And that was just such a hopeful, excellent example of allowing the person to be themselves and to be there for them. And it provided such a supportive environment. And then there was another fantastic small charity that met individuals coming out of prison who did have nowhere to go. It used entirely peer-to-peer support. So it used individuals who'd been in prison with a drug-related offence, had no home, and so they'd walked that journey. And then they were able to take, of course, it was a small charity, so this doesn't do the numbers, but it enabled these individuals to have a roof over their heads and to either train for something, do volunteering, or enabling them over time to get into work. And so examples like that.
Is that where you think the way forward is? Maybe using those smaller charities or places that have got their own projects? Or do you think the government has to take a bigger kind of organisational role on this?
I think you need both. I think what's happened in the last few years is quite a few of those charities have been cut out of the agenda as far as funding is concerned, because I'm sure you're probably aware with local authority commission funding of the service, each time the contract came up for renewal, and in my opinion, it comes up too often. Often it's a 3-yearly cycle. Then the next time the contract goes out, they offer less money. So it tends to go to rather big organizations who are delivering the service, and they subcontract. And often they just don't subcontract to these smaller organizations that provide a very useful service, often in a sort of boutique way. I mean, we heard quite a lot from the BAME community of how their needs were not served, because they really wanted to see more people in the service of their own colour and their own people. They wanted to be helped by people who knew what their culture was, and we don't see that enough.
What are you going to recommend? Because you're due to make a recommendation to the government. I'm sure there's plenty for you to put down. When, and just sort of, can you sum up what it is you're going to say that we should be doing?
What I can do, I'll tell you when, and I can tell you the areas I've concentrated on. Of course, I can't give you the exact recommendation.
Oh, go on.
No, I can't. It's hopefully the end of April, so very close. What I say really in the report, the current situation is intolerable. The 4 areas that we've concentrated on and where you would see the recommendations: radical reform of funding. You can't do this without starting to put back in funding into the system. A reform of commissioning so that we can ensure that the right things are commissioned for this population, and leadership, and there I mean leadership both at the centre and leadership locally. Rebuilding of the services, I will have recommended, and don't mind talking about this, that addiction is treated as a health condition and given parity with other health conditions, chronic conditions. You wouldn't treat a serious diabetic or someone with, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis the way you treat somebody who is drug dependent. So it needs to come in to the family of chronic conditions, have parity. So we've got to rebuild the services, the way we approach these people.
Okay, just to play devil's advocate here, but someone with a chronic condition like diabetes is not committing a lot of crimes to feed their problem. I mean, I suppose that's what people would say.
No, that's what people would say, but I think once you've done 2 years of working in this area, you have an awful lot of sad people, not bad people. By the time you are addicted to heroin, you don't have a choice. And when you talk to individuals who are in that situation, so many of them have a really awful childhood. There's a lot of history of trauma. There's a lot of mental health, of course. And if you can give them good treatment and recovery, we know from the stats and from the figures that they commit far less crime, and you can start to stabilize them and enable them to have a more secure future. So of course I know people say that, but if you want to stop serious crime, you want to stop these homicides, you've got to concentrate on the 300,000 that are heroin and crack addicts, and you've got to do something different.
It's interesting when you put it like that, a figure of 300,000 people. So are you saying that if we really are smart about this and concentrate our efforts in the correct way on what you could describe as quite a relatively small targetable group, you could really make a big difference here?
You can make a huge difference, and I don't want you to think they're the only group you should concentrate on, but we know 86% of the problem, if you like, it is in that 300,000 who are really long-term heroin and crack addicts. Most of the 20 billion that is spent by this government in order to deal with this situation goes in the criminal justice system. Then, of course, there'll be some in health and benefits. But we spend nearly 20 billion to deal with the problem, and we spend at the moment only 650 million on treatment. There seems to me to be some mismatch there, and the gangs that sell these products take out 9 billion a year in their profits. So if we concentrated on that group and really got to grips with them, you do then have to provide a service, which isn't good at the moment, for the people who do find themselves addicted to other drugs. And that we need to build that service.
Can you give me a ballpark figure in terms of the amount of money you think we would need to be spending, to really start cracking this properly?
I think if I'm being honest, Andy, I'm not going to give you a figure at the moment, because what we've been doing, and it will be in the report, is we're trying to get to figures that encompass not just the pharmacological and non-pharmacological cost of treatment and recovery, but the cost of housing, which we're working on at the moment, and of enabling people to have something purposeful to do, i.e. support for employment, because actually you've got to put the whole thing into a package. If you miss off safe housing and you miss off the opportunity to do something meaningful, well, people will go back to their habits. It's a very complex situation.
But it sounds like, we are talking about certainly hundreds of millions, if not, are we talking about even a billion, in terms of spending? I mean, is that reasonable?
We're talking about a reasonable amount of money, but if you think that we haven't spent on this, we've been taking money out for the last 10 years, then we've got to consider that we need to put back in, but we have to prove to the Treasury that it's going to be a return on investment. I know that from the work I've been doing, and the analysts calculate that for every pound you put in, you would get £4 back. I think they calculated within 2 years, and within 10 years you'd get £20 back. But these are figures that we're sort of working on at the moment.
Okay, I mean, in your conversations with government, I know you haven't put the phase 2 report in yet, but you must have been having some conversations. Do you get a good sense that they are on the same wavelength as the sort of thing that you're talking about?
I get a sense that this government actually wants to do something about this. And I mean, I'm sure you're aware the Prime Minister has spoken about this, and really from the point of view of serious crime, drugs drive 50% of crime. They want to do something about this. But the challenge for government, and I lay it out quite clearly in the review, is it requires 6 government departments to come together in a meaningful and sustainable way to really bring about this change. It's the Home Office, Justice, Health, DWP, local government and education. And the challenge is, and I suppose has always been, to enable and persuade those 6 departments that drug dependency is part of their brief, although probably not certainly top of their list.
In terms of the sort of big principle that you laid out earlier, the idea of treating it as a public health issue rather than a sort of law and order issue, do you get from government the sense that, yes, we go along with that?
I get the sense that from the Criminal Justice Department, for example, that it would be helpful to them if we had much better treatment and recovery services, much swifter and more effective services for people leaving prison, so that not so many people have to be sent to prison for 2 to 3 to 4 months sentencing when, you know, they're exposed to even more drugs than they perhaps were exposed to in the outside. I mean, spice is such a common prison drug and such a nasty drug. So I think we have been in very close discussion with the criminal justice system because the whole message of my part 2 is it has to be whole system, and every time you take away one bit of it, then you reduce the effect and the results you're going to get.
Just a couple more questions, Dame Carol. I mean, I'm just interested also from your, if I could put it like this, personal point of view. You've come into this since 2019. You've been working on this. I mean, is it quite tough for you having to go through all this and see people in very difficult circumstances and see the scale of the problems? I mean, how do you manage it, or does it take its toll on you a wee bit?
Yes, of course it does, because you just see so many destroyed or diminished lives. You see people, young people particularly, where you can see the pattern of exclusion from school, sent to a PRU, attracted, you know, by a gang because they offer them things which their homes have never offered them, inter-county lines, vulnerable, may even be killed. You see families torn apart, and you see it in the worst and most deprived areas of our country. Yes, I've seen awful things, but quite frankly, it's just made me determined, if at all possible, through these 2 reports, one, to have laid the problem bare, but secondly, to try and offer a coordinated approach to how we could do it much better and we could help these people. I would, of course, almost like to see as much effort put into prevention, you know, therefore at the level of young people. I haven't been able to address that in detail, but, you know, going to prison and seeing people who, you know, can't read or write, have never had a job, been in and out of prison 20 times, regard prison as a safe place and they don't have to sleep on the streets. That has to influence.
We're getting very close to you presenting hopefully your phase 2 report in next month. Final thought, I mean, are you hopeful, having come through, seen everything you've seen, the work you've done now at this point, are you hopeful that we could be on the brink of maybe making some improvements?
I am hopeful. I've spent this whole past year trying to work with those departments whose support I need to make this possible. I'm hopeful that there are some very good people in those departments who do see it, who do get the message. Of course, it will be a government and treasury decision, but I wouldn't like you to think it's just funding that will change this. It's workforce, it's doing things differently, it's joining things up differently, and it's doing it on a sustainable basis, which is so essential. That's why I think it needs to be part of on parity with other health conditions.
Dame Carol Black, thanks very much for talking to us.
Okay, thank you.
Dame Carol Black with a plea to see drugs as a public health issue, not one of law and order, and to see drug addicts as, in her words, sad, not bad. We wait now for her report to go into government and then for the response. It can't come soon enough. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for another podcast, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at andybell5news. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.